Welcome to Marrow Masters Season 10, sponsored by Pharmacyclics & Janssen and Insight. The National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, established in 1992, strives to help patients, caregivers, and families cope with the psychosocial challenges of bone marrow and stem cell transplant from diagnosis through survivorship. Season 10 focuses on sharing hope and inspiration regarding chronic graft versus host disease, or GVHD. This season will cover the importance of clinical trials, find out what survivors wish they and their loved ones had known before, during, and after transplant, and even talk about the unique needs of young adults. Here's your host, Executive Director of the NBMT Link, Peggy Burkhart.
Welcome, everyone. Today we have Dr. Matt Kalaycio of Cleveland Clinic, who is the Vice Chairman of the Taussig Cancer Institute, who is going to talk to us about clinical trials, the hope they bring, the lives they save, and why they are so important when we talk about graft versus host disease. So often, the survivor feels that they trade one disease for another. So today we hope to convey that there is so much to be hopeful about, especially these past 5 years, thanks to clinical trials. Hello, Dr. Kalaycio. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So Dr. Kalaycio, let's dig in. Please tell us why clinical trials for people of all ages are so important when we talk about graft versus host disease.
So I think the important thing to level set is that graft versus host disease is horrible. Most of your listeners already know that, but it's important to understand that when things are bad, then we strive to make things better. And the best way that medical science has to make things better is via studies and clinical trials, experiments, if you will. But when we think about experiments, we often think about, in the laboratory experiments, but that's not what a clinical trial is. A clinical trial is the application of what we learn in the lab in the clinic. And that is how we decide and learn over time what treatments work and what treatments don't.
Okay, let's break it down. Can you share some of the examples of successful trials these past few years that we're hearing about?
Absolutely. And they are very exciting and are setting the stage for additional trials to come in the future. So there are trials that have happened and have been reported. We'll get into the details of how trials work in a bit, but here's the outcome of some very important ones. There's two types of graft versus host disease, as most of your listeners will know. The first is acute graft versus host disease that occurs often in the early part after a transplant, so let's say the first 3 months. And there are two trials that are very important that have improved our ability to care for patients afflicted with acute graft versus host disease. The first is actually called the REACH-1 trial. It was published in 2020. And later in 2020, a second trial called REACH-2 was also published. REACH-1 and REACH-2 explored the activity of a drug called Ruxolitinib in acute graft versus host disease. Ruxolitinib is FDA approved now for GVHD, but it wasn't at the time, but it has previously been approved for some other diseases like myelofibrosis. And so we had some experience with it, but not in GVHD. There was some preclinical, so experimental work that suggested that it might work in the right setting. And so in these trials, patients with acute graft versus host disease for whom treatment wasn't working, and our primary treatment is prednisone. So in this case, prednisone wasn't working very well, and so we tried Ruxolitinib in these two trials. Compared to what we have previously learned about graft versus host disease in REACH-1, and then compared to a control group in REACH-2, a randomized trial, those patients who received Ruxolitinib had a significantly higher overall response rate compared to the control group, a difference of 62% versus 39%. That's a big difference in response rates. And just as importantly, they were more likely to experience a complete remission, which means that there was no evidence of graft versus host disease with treatment. This happened 34% of the time with the Ruxolitinib compared to not using it. As a result of these responses, both overall survival, which is the most important thing, and failure-free survival, which means surviving until something else happens, maybe relapse or something like that, was also in favor of the Ruxolitinib to a significant degree. All of these results ultimately led the FDA to approve Ruxolitinib for the treatment of acute graft versus host disease. But that's not where the story ends by any means. Most of your listeners will be familiar with chronic graft versus host disease, and that's the disease that often informs a lot of the ongoing misery that can come along with allogeneic transplant down the road. Back in 2017, there were no FDA-approved treatments for chronic graft versus host disease, even though 50% of patients who've had an allogeneic transplant were at risk. So there was some work being done that suggested that a type of drug called a tyrosine kinase inhibitor could affect outcomes in transplant. And so a drug that was already FDA approved for chronic lymphocytic leukemia named Ibrutinib was simply tried in patients with chronic graft versus host disease. And to everyone's surprise, the overall response rate for that population of patients was 67%. So 2/3 of patients responded when they were not responding to anything up to that point. That led in 2017 to Ibrutinib's FDA approval for the treatment of chronic graft versus host disease. This was then followed in 2021 with the drug we had previously talked about. Ruxolitinib was tested in chronic graft versus host disease in the REACH-3 trial. This was a comparison of Ruxolitinib to best available therapy. And at the time of the study was done, Ibrutinib wasn't available, so it was not the best available therapy, or it's other therapies. But the response rate after treatment was 49% versus 25%. So here's Ruxolitinib that had already shown benefit for acute graft versus host disease being approved for chronic graft versus host disease. So there's two drugs, both of which actually are tyrosine kinase inhibitors, that were effective. And the story doesn't end there. There's another drug called Belumosudil, which works by a completely different mechanism that some scientists involved in the treatment of graft versus host disease suggested could work against a different pathway of inflammation called the ROCK pathway. And this drug inhibits that. So they thought through some preclinical work that this drug could also be effective in chronic graft versus host disease. And when applied to patients who had even been already treated with Ibrutinib or Ruxolitinib, they found an overall response rate of 74%, whether or not the drug was given daily or twice a day, which is the way the study was designed. And during treatment with this drug called Belumosudil, 65% of patients were able to reduce the dose of their steroids. So as a result, the FDA approved Belumosudil for the treatment of chronic graft versus host disease. And all of these drugs that I've mentioned are now being used in the clinic, and we're using them in sequence. We don't know which one should go first. We don't know if we should combine them. We don't know a lot about how we could sequence them, and those will be the subjects of future clinical trials. But it's great to have the tools with which to advance the science, even as we are helping patients in the clinic.
This must just be so exciting to see and be a part of after so many years of not having these incredible options. I can imagine it makes your job somewhat easier.
Well, it certainly makes it more pleasant.
Yes.
It may not make it easier. Clinical trials can be difficult to work with, but it's worth it. So this was 2017 when the first of these drugs started to come online. I started taking care of patients with graft versus host disease in 1992. In that period of time, we had steroids and we had a bunch of other immunosuppressing therapies that worked a little bit maybe, but none of them worked any better than steroids did. And long-term steroids have significant long-term consequences. So I am thrilled to be able to say that in my lifetime as a bone marrow transplanter, I've been able to witness the rise of new treatments that actually work for a disease that we didn't think anything would work for when I got started.
Just so exciting. And thank you for sharing that. This season is about the hope and inspiration. And if we aren't just hitting the nail on the head right now, I can imagine there's going to be more excitement in the years to come. And we're just going to want to hear about it all. So thank you so much for sharing that. So we know that clinical trials can be frightening, very intimidating. Dr. Kalaycio, can you explain why they should not be feared? And I think you've already done that by the results, but in the middle of the process, how can someone feel less afraid and more hopeful about being a part of one?
Right. When many patients hear a clinical trial being talked about, they think to themselves that they're being experimented on, or this is an experimental therapy. No one knows if it's going to work. And they think to themselves, and it often comes out that what they really want is just, doc, you just do what you think's best. Let's not go with the clinical trial. Well, the fact is, as a practicing clinician, I think clinical trials are the best thing to do for several reasons. The first being, it's been shown that those patients that participate in clinical trials, no matter what the disease, have better outcomes than those who don't participate in clinical trials. Now, that may be a selection process, or it may be that the clinical trial forces the physician's hand in following the recipe that's prescribed by the clinical trial itself. We call it a protocol. So that protocol has to be followed to manage the trial. And as we follow the protocol, it keeps us from doing things on a whim, or because we think it's a good idea, or because we feel bad because someone has nausea or someone has a rash. Because the protocol tells us how to manage it and what to do if things don't work out right, we're better clinicians as a result. Everyone's being treated equally, not one person getting indifferent treatment. And finally, it's the idea that patients consider clinical trials as maybe they're being thought of as a guinea pig, but that's not true. When we treat guinea pigs in an experiment, we don't really care what happens to that guinea pig or that lab rat, but we really care what happens to our patients. So all of these protocols have safety built into them. And when you don't have a protocol, when you're not following a clinical trial, safety is less. And so clinical trials offer ways to improve results in a safe environment that we cannot otherwise offer. So I understand the fear that comes with the unknown. And I'm hoping that through this wonderful podcast that we can reduce some of that fear and increase our accrual to some of these important trials.
Now, I just want to clarify something. Not everyone is being asked to be in a clinical trial. So I don't want people to think, oh, I wasn't asked. Am I going to, what's going to happen to me? I would imagine it's a very select, small number in the scheme of things. Is that correct?
Well, it's true and it's not true. So when someone's beginning their journey, if someone needs a bone marrow transplant, somewhere along the way, they're probably going to be offered a clinical trial.
Oh, okay.
So somewhere along the way, when you're first diagnosed, as the treatments go on, even at the time of transplant, clinical trials come to the fore somewhere along the way, most likely. After the transplant and in the setting of graft versus host disease, we might not offer a clinical trial because we might not have one. Not every center has one. Not every center has one that's particularly important for that particular patient at that particular time. But as time goes on and say graft versus host disease comes and it becomes more difficult to treat, it's more likely that a clinical trial will be offered. Maybe not at that center, but maybe someplace else. And so because cancer is different than, say, the management of, I'm making this up, high blood pressure, we make it a point to offer clinical trials whenever possible because they're such devastating diseases. And so we want them not to be. And the way to make them not to be is by offering them. But you're right, not everyone will be offered. That doesn't mean that we don't think you're a good person or that you're not worthy, but we just don't have one that's ready at the time for your particular situation. But if the situation is appropriate, we always offer.
Okay, good to know. So let's go over the phases of clinical trials.
Sure. So this can be a little confusing, but it really shouldn't be. Clinical trials come in 3 classic phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And phase 1 is when we're first trying a new drug. If there is a trial that you might not be excited about, it might be a phase 1 trial, because in general, phase 1 trials, we don't know if that drug works. We're trying to make sure that it's safe. We want to find out if it works, but we also are more interested in a phase 1 trial to make sure that it's actually safe to give. So phase 1 trials are for new drugs that are being tested in folks who really don't have any other options. Unfortunately, in cancer, that happens a lot. And so phase 1 is the first try to see if a drug will work. Phase 2 presumes that we've already gone through phase 1. We know the drug is safe. The trials I talked to you earlier had already been FDA approved. And so there were no phase 1 trials for graft versus host disease. We didn't need them because they had already been done for these other entities. So they got introduced into the clinic as phase 2, which means a population of patients that are roughly the same. Let's just say patients with acute graft versus host disease are given a drug at a dose, at a schedule, for a period of time, and everyone's treated the same. That's how we find out what the response rate is if we think it works in those patients. Plus, it allows us to determine side effect profile even further for the next phase, which is phase 3. And phase 3 is when we do randomized trials. These are the trials when you enroll, you can think of it as a computer flipping a coin, and you get treatment A or you get treatment B. Treatment A is usually a control arm or a treatment that, say, is what we've always done, steroids, if you will, or something that's already a known entity. And arm B, the other possibility, is this new treatment in whatever schedule or form it comes in. So we wouldn't put someone on a new treatment without already knowing how safe it was. That's what phase 1 and phase 2 are for. So in phase 3, we're confident about the safety and we're comparing the two treatments to determine whether or not one is any better than the other in terms of how they actually work. We also look at side effects too, but we're already comfortable with the safety of both sides of that study.
Well, thank you for that. That was great. Important to break it down and understand it. So we talk about informed consent in a trial. What is this and how important is it?
Right. Back in the old days, in less enlightened times, the medical profession would just try something. So we would give patients something and we wouldn't tell them what we're doing. We were very paternalistic about it. But those days have gone. We can no longer morally, ethically, or legally treat someone with something without their knowledge. And so we go through a very formalized, informed consent process to ensure that that doesn't happen anymore. So when people think about informed consent, they often think it's signing a document that indicates that they actually know about what's going on. But informed consent is so much more than that. Think of it as an interactive communication between the physician and the patient to get to a point where both are comfortable with proceeding before the paper is signed. The paper that people sign, which is often electronic these days, is important because it does show that the two people were in the same room at the same time. But without that interactive communication, it's just a signature. A signature on a check won't do anything unless the numbers are filled in. And the informed consent process is the filling in of the numbers. It goes back and forth to make sure everyone is comfortable with it. And it also describes the treatment that's about to come. So it's not just saying, yeah, throw it at me. It's, yeah, I'm agreeing to this, and this, so that the protocol can go on and the patient is completely aware of what should and what will happen.
Well, thank you very much. And I seem to recall hearing that anyone that's in a clinical can bow out at any time should there be a reason. And I think that's important for people to realize. If something happens with their health or there's a reason, they are not held legally to this agreement. Is that correct?
That is correct. Once signed, that's permission for us to start the process, but it doesn't mean that process can't be stopped. In fact, both the patient and the physician can stop the trial at any time. The patient can stop it for whatever reason they want. Maybe they just don't like to do it anymore. Maybe they don't want to travel for all the studies that are required. Maybe they're having side effects that they don't want to have anymore. They can stop the trial. And the physician can too. If he or she thinks that the patient is suffering, and sometimes patients won't stop, we can stop it ourselves. We can especially stop it if we don't think it's working, or if we think there's something better out there, we can stop the trial and go to something else.
Well, good. I'm glad we talked about that a bit. So how are these clinical trials funded? I think we have to talk about that.
Yeah, you can imagine all of that goes into these trials. The personnel involved, the drugs themselves, the oversight takes people, time, and money. The most common ways these studies are funded are by industry, which means the drug companies themselves, the very people who make the drugs we talked about, funded the studies that we just talked about. We also have the federal government through grants, either from the NIH, the NCI, the Defense Department, or other governmental agencies often fund, especially the larger studies like the phase 3 trials often come from federal grants and organizations. And finally, philanthropic grants. When you see these fundraisers at institutions raising money for cancer research, well, that's what they're doing. They're raising money to fund these clinical trials. We do it here. Every large center in the country does the same thing. And it's really necessary if we're going to be able to fund some of the even more novel therapies that are being developed at the local level and are just getting started before the government would really take an interest.
Well, that's really good to know. I did not realize that. Let's talk about the best reputable sites to find a clinical trial, Dr. Kalaycio.
Sure. For your listeners, I would say the first place you should go in looking for a trial is to your physicians themselves. So the best place, if you are my patient, you should ask me rather than head to the internet. I would know what studies are available and which ones might be most appropriate. And so if you're out there wondering about if there's a trial out there for you, the first place you should go is to your clinical team. Second is the internet, where there are some reputable sites. And I say reputable because there are also some irreputable sites. And I would suggest two to begin with. The first is the site of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, but there are other similar sites of large nonprofits like them that have sections that not only describe the clinical trial process, but also can guide you to some trials that might actually be out there available. The other one that lists every clinical trial that's out there is clinicaltrials.gov, and it is just that, clinicaltrials, no spaces, .gov. Every trial is listed there. That particular website can be a little cumbersome to navigate, but it's a wonderful resource for finding trials in your area, in the disease or illness that you're interested in. But again, the place to go first is your own treatment team.
Excellent advice. Thank you. So let's talk a minute about the Cleveland Clinic. What are some of the clinical trials at your center that you might want to share some information about?
So that's very kind of you to ask. As a large center, transplant center, we obviously are very interested in pursuing clinical trials. We're trying to advance the science. And we do have some trials that are available, many of which are also available elsewhere. So for the trials that I'm about to talk about, you might want to check with your local clinicians who may also be offering the same trial. So the one we are actively enrolling in now is a trial of a drug called antitrypsin alpha-1 for acute graft versus host disease. So antitrypsin is an FDA-approved drug for antitrypsin deficiency. It's a lung disease, and that agent has been around forever. We know that it's safe to give. We know how to give it. And there's some evidence from laboratory results that it might help with acute graft versus host disease. And so we're running a trial looking at it to see whether or not it actually does work. Likewise, we have studies for chronic graft versus host disease, but we also have, I'm trying to think of the best way to put this, studies of gut flora, which means bacteria in the bowels. So it turns out that we know that the kind of bacteria in the gut is very important in determining the outcome of graft versus host disease. It may even determine whether or not you get it, but it definitely impacts the severity of the disease and perhaps even its treatment. What we don't know is how to manipulate that gut bacteria, that gut flora, to make things better. If we knew how to manipulate that, then we might not only be able to prevent graft versus host disease, we can perhaps make it less severe or maybe even treat it. And so we're doing studies of the microbiome to help figure out how to treat graft versus host disease in new and completely unexpected ways. And one offshoot of that, because it's gut bacteria we're talking about, the bacteria in the gut creates organic compounds that are released in our breath and can be detected. There are computer chips that can do breath analysis of this kind of thing. And we're using them here to better be able to figure out graft versus host disease and how to manage it. So it's not crazy that your doctor might want you to breathe into a tube to figure out what's going on with your graft versus host disease and come up with a specific antibacterial program based on that breath analysis in the future. That would really be something.
That sounds incredible. Wow. Yeah. These are the kinds of things that we're going to talk years from now, and it's going to be standard. So that's how these things evolve.
I hope so.
And thank you for all the great work you are doing there. Time to kind of close things up. And I guess I just want to ask you, what inspires you to, I know you work with these patients and I know how passionate you are. How do you get through it? How do you stay so positive? How do you continue to offer that hope and inspiration?
Yes, there are plenty of downsides to being a bone marrow transplanter and working with cancer patients in general. But through clinical investigation, the active application of these clinical trials, that kind of work inspires me as a clinical investigator, but it should also give hope to those afflicted with graft versus host disease that they can be both a recipient and a benefactor of these results we've been talking about. They can actually participate in their own future treatment. That promises less suffering in the future for everybody.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kalaycio. And one thing I was just thinking about, we hear so often, some of the long haulers, they hear, it's not supposed to last this long and they're just so defeated and it's not burning out. But then I'll talk to them a few years later and it did eventually. They did get there. They did stay hopeful. Anything for those long haulers because they are such incredibly special people to us.
Yes. So this is a marathon, not a sprint. I'm certain that before the transplant came, that their physicians talked about that this is over the long time. It's very difficult to think long-term when you're ill right now. Mm-hmm. But if you can get through the right now, there is absolutely every hope that things can and often do improve in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I feel inspired today, and I know that people are really going to appreciate this episode. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Peggy. I'd also like to thank the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link for the opportunity to share my insights and personal experiences on this challenging topic.
This has been the Marrow Masters podcast. If you know someone who would benefit from the information in our show, please share this episode with them. And don't miss future episodes of our show. Follow Marrow Masters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now. And to connect with the National Bone Marrow Transplant Link, visit nbmtlink.org or follow the link in our show notes.